All right, we're about to dive into a document that is, believe it or not, only 3 words long. But here's the thing. Within those 3 little words is an ambiguity so deep, so fundamental, it makes us question the very way we interpret data. So, welcome to the case of the coded colors.
So here it is, our main piece of evidence, the exhibit. It's a super simple list, right? Just 3 words, red, yellow, and blue. But the problem, it just jumps right off the page, doesn't it? This has nothing to do with color theory. It's all about the capitalization. Why is 1 in all caps, 1 totally lowercase, and the last one just title case? What's going on here?
And that really brings us to the heart of the matter. Are we looking at something deliberate here? A coded signal, a hidden structure that tells us how these things are supposed to work? Or is it just meaningless stylistic noise? A typo, or maybe some junk left over from a messy data transfer?
Okay, to get to the bottom of this, we're going to explore 2 totally competing philosophies. Think of them as 2 different investigators, looking at the exact same clues, but, and this is the key, coming to completely different conclusions.
So, on one side, you've got an analyst who's convinced that in data, especially when you don't have a lot of it, nothing is an accident. They look at this and see a deliberate, structural signal. But on the other side, you've got an analyst who's saying, whoa, hold on. They're wanting that without hard proof, we should just assume it's noise, maybe a serialization artifact, which is really just a fancy way of saying it's some leftover formatting junk from when the data was saved or moved around.
Let's actually give these 2 a name, shall we? We'll call them the structuralist and the pragmatist. The structuralist's whole argument is that with so little information to go on, we have to pay super close attention to these internal patterns. But the pragmatist, they're pushing back, saying, look, if we start inventing meaning where there isn't any, we're just going to build fragile, high-maintenance systems that are a nightmare to deal with.
Okay, so let's really dig into the evidence here. And we're going to start with the most obvious clue on the table, the capitalization itself.
Now, if you're the structuralist, this capitalization is anything but random. It's a crystal clear hierarchy. To them, red in all caps just screams system constant, right? It's a foundational value, something that never changes. Then you've got blue, in title case, which feels like a defined object, maybe a class or some kind of resource. And poor yellow, all lowercase. That's got to be on a lower tier. It's just a local variable, maybe a temporary state. The big idea here is that red and blue are in one primary class and yellow is something else entirely, something subordinate.
But of course, the pragmatist is not having it. They push back, and they push back hard. Their whole point is that this fantasy of perfect intentional formatting just doesn't survive in the real world. Come on. Data gets moved, it gets converted, it gets retyped by people. If you rely on something like capitalization, you're creating what they call a brittle bias. And what that means is you're basically building a system that's designed to break. It could completely fall apart the second it runs into some process that, automatically converts everything to lowercase. Poof, it's gone.
And this quote just nails the pragmatist's biggest fear. We're essentially elevating typography to the level of schema, and that makes me very nervous. Think about what that means. You're building your system's fundamental rules, its entire blueprint, on something as flimsy as whether a letter is capitalized or not. It's like trying to build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand. It's just not going to work.
The structuralist isn't done, though. They've got another piece of evidence up their sleeve, the file name. It's red0092325.pdf. And they ask a really sharp question here. If all 3 of these colors were functionally the same, why on earth is the whole file named after the one that's in all caps? That pretty strongly suggests that red is a primary key, an architectural anchor for the entire system.
The pragmatist, though, has a different read on it. They're like, sure, it's in the file name, but that doesn't have to mean it's superior. Red could just be the entry point for a workflow. Think of it as step A. And the document just lists the next steps, which are totally equal. Step B is yellow, and step C is blue. Just because you're first in line doesn't automatically make you the boss.
Now look, this isn't just some abstract academic debate. The choice you make between these 2 interpretations, well, it has huge, real-world consequences for how you design a system, how stable it is, and where you decide to put your most critical resources.
And here's the pragmatist's nightmare scenario, right? Let's say we go with the structuralist model. It defines yellow as some minor subordinate thing. So, naturally, it gets hardly any computing resources. But what if yellow is actually the main event? What if it's the complex engine that's doing like 90% of the heavy lifting? Well, your system would be starved of resources exactly where it needs them the most, and that leads to bottlenecks or maybe even total system failure.
But the structuralist has a defense, and it's all about clarity. From their perspective, the benefit is definition, that structure lets us pinpoint failure points much faster. Okay, yeah, maybe the model is a bit more complex, but that complexity gives you modularity. So if something breaks with yellow, you know exactly where to look. You're looking for a process failure, not a data constant error. And trust me, that distinction can make debugging way, way faster.
And at this point, you can really feel the structuralists' frustration starting to boil over. They're basically saying the pragmatist's approach is just paralysis. If you treat the only clue you have, the capitalization, as meaningless noise, then you're just throwing away any chance for insight. You can't even start the process of building a model. You have to start with some hypothesis, even if it feels a little fragile, just so you have something to test against.
So this brings us to the climax of our little investigation. The analyst has to make a choice, and it's so much bigger than just 3 colors. It's really about a fundamental fork in the road, a choice between 2 entirely different analytical philosophies.
And you know, it all boils down to a pretty fundamental disagreement about the burden of proof. On one side of the scale, you've got the structuralist's motto. When your data is sparse, patterns are absolutely everything. The burden of proof, they say, is on anyone who wants to claim a visible pattern is meaningless. But on the other side of the scale is the pragmatist credo. Stick to parsimony. You know, Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is probably the best one, and the burden of proof is on the person trying to argue for some complex hidden structure.
But maybe the point isn't to pick a winner here. You know, the real takeaway might just be that the process itself is the actual finding. The best, most robust systems, they aren't built from one single rigid idea. They actually emerge from the intense debate between these 2 competing views. Because that whole process, that friction, it forces us to ask better, harder, more important questions.
And so that leaves us with one final question. And this one's for you. When you're faced with ambiguous data in your own work, what's your gut instinct? Do you immediately start hunting for the hidden pattern, convinced there has to be a signal in the noise? Or do you design for resilience and just prepare for the random chaos you know is coming in the real world?